Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is, I believe, my largest audience ever, so thank you.
Your best audience.
Yeah, my best audience. The superlatives keep rolling in. So, as I get familiar, Adam has done a great job of coaching me. Quickly, why I study such an obscure topic? And the answer is very simple. My dad was a Swedish tax exile, and our family moved to the Bahamas where there's no tax. Right after the war, and to work for relatives who had worked for the owner of Electrolux. I know it sounds a little complicated. The owner of Electrolux, a Swedish guy, married an American, who believed in world peace and global trade, and he thought if we all, he had the world's largest yacht, the Southern Cross, and if we could all go around the world talking shop and talking business, we'd get along and nobody would go to war. Unfortunately, he was wrong. We went to war. He was blacklisted by the Americans and had to spend the war in Mexico because he couldn't take his yacht through the Panama Canal. Before that happened, he befriended, or rather the Duke of Windsor, who was another sort of Nazi-leaning official on the Allied side. He had befriended him. The Duke of Windsor loved money and power, and they were both exiled in the Bahamas during the war. And so the fact that this guy, Venegrin of Electrolux, his sister, had either married Goering or anyway, there was too many rumors, too much bad press, and he was kicked off our side. There was labor riots in the Bahamas, where my dad, has spent 60 years, and it was simple. The Americans marched in and said, "We're at war. We've got to build an airfield. We'll pay you $10 a day." The British had been paying $3 a day. So when the Americans left after having paid everyone $10 a day for 2 years, of course the locals said, "Well, if you want us to go back to work, we want at least $10 a day." And the British said, "No way. You're going to get $3.50 and be happy." And they said, "No, yes, no," and they shot. The British shot a bunch of locals that had rioted and killed a few of them. It is not a way to, they needed a way forward. So Venegrin said, "Okay, Duke, I got tons of money and I own Paradise Island. Why don't I just pay thousands of your locals to hand dig a canal across the island, like effectively a canal to nowhere. Let's just keep your local guys happy. We'll pay them like $6 a day, and problem solved." So that's what they did. Everyone was happy. The canal was like 3 feet deep. It's now Atlantis. And of course, the locals said, the Swede, he built a German U-boat pen. 3 feet deep. The German U-boat's like 30 feet deep, but notwithstanding. And he refueled U-boats. Well, there was no fuel was rationed. How could you possibly get 50 tons of diesel to an island without anyone noticing? So it was all rumors, it was all lies. But the Americans were confused because the submarines, which we'll get to, by the way, those are the little red dots represent all the or most of the attacks on our ships by the Germans and the Italians. So, as you see, there's red dots everywhere. In New Orleans, Panama, Trinidad. When they got tired of sinking tankers coming from Houston through the Bahamas or Aruba and Venezuela through the Bahamas, they would switch and go down here and hit the bauxite trade. Bauxite was really important. Nobody knows about it nowadays, but to make aluminum, to make airplanes, you needed iron ores, bauxites, and different ores. So, sorry, cancel. All right. Oh yeah. So the whole history is really quite interesting. Yeah. So why did I write it? To clear the family name, basically. And while doing that, I discovered this whole story that no one else seemed to know, which is that the Italians and Germans had free reign over my country, the Bahamas, for as often as they wanted to, and some like 500 Allied sailors, a lot of them naked, covered in oil, starving and demoralized, washed up on the beaches in the Bahamas, where they were rescued. The Bahamas, by the way, is like 85% black and sort of 10 or 15% white, and a bit Haitian. But what would happen was, you get 30 to 50 white guys washing up in a black community covered in oil, and the local blacks would say, "Whose side are you on? Are you German, Italian?" They're like, "Oh, we're on your side. It's okay." Well, things can't be going really well. Like, if you represent our side and you just like barely survive getting sunk, this can't be good. And the British, of course, didn't want the locals to know that things weren't going very well. So they conveniently buried it. Nobody knows what letters were sent from the Duke of Windsor to the Foreign Office in London and sent back. Nobody can find them. You've looked in castles, they've looked in archives, they've been redacted. They were embarrassing to the British, so they've conveniently been lost. So, Dönitz, on the other hand, the head of the German Navy, insisted that every single page of every single minute of every hour of every torpedo of every artillery shell of every sailor get preserved. He was proud of the job they had done, and he wanted everyone to know the job they'd done while the other Nazis were all burning their records. This guy, and I think one of his officers was indicted in the Nuremberg war crimes for shooting at allies of the water, which in the fog of war, it's kind of difficult to know when they're off at night and when they're not. And, in the Bahamas, very few people got shot that way because there was no counterattack. Germans would do whatever they wanted. They'd hang around for hours, they'd give cigarettes, blankets, water, navigation advice, they'd turn over lifeboats. It was generally pretty friendly interactions because they had no fear of being counterattacked. They could spend as much time as they wanted. By the way, in the Pacific, it was well-documented common practice that the Americans would shoot Japanese in the water to death, and the Japanese would do the same. So there were no saints, really no saints in World War II. So U-boats in the Bahamas, these are just the U-boats that were sunk in the area. Very low payback for 130 ships. Essentially, really, there's only 2 or 3 U-boats that were sunk in the Bahamas proper in exchange for 130 ships. I'm not good at math, but pretty bad odds. That one was northwest of Bermuda, technically out of the area. This is south of Bermuda. All of these guys were killed. This was sunk by a Cuban boat that we had given to the Cubans, and they sank it. Pan American airplane saw this sub, radioed it to the U.S. Navy. U.S. Navy radioed it to the Cuban Navy. The Cuban Navy sank the sub and then broke off for lunch. And the Americans thought that was pretty irresponsible. Like, aren't you supposed to keep killing the sub? They said, but we killed it. Like, how many times do you want us to kill the sub? So they went to lunch, and it turns out that the Cubans were right. They indeed had sunk it in about half an hour. So that was the kind of hodgepodge, like, retaliation methods we had. FDR had been Undersecretary of the Navy in the First World War, and he was obsessed with small boats. Somehow small boats were going to protect our coast. So he got a bunch of yachtsmen from New England to go out, the Corsair fleet. We spent more time rescuing the yachtsmen than they did anything effective. Of course, a lot of whales got blown up because, like, I saw them, bomb the hell out of it. It was really bad for the Baleen fleet. The Corsair, and it just didn't work. The only thing that worked was following the British advice, which we didn't do for the first year. And forgive me if I sound cynical. I just live this stuff. I have to read it over and over. You read the telegrams from the British. Monday, the Germans are coming. They'll be there on Saturday. Tuesday, the Germans are coming. They'll be there on Saturday. This is where the Germans are. They're going to be there by Saturday. This is exactly. They just sank the first 3 ships. And we just ignored it. We were so obsessed with killing Japanese after Pearl Harbor, kind of like after 9/11. That we just weren't paying attention. And, it took, like, if you can imagine this, we insisted that the mayors of southern cities like Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Miami, that they shut their lights off because, the ships were being sunk because the Germans could line up the ships in the silhouette against the lights and have much better, we were basically helping the enemy. And the mayors of these towns said, no, you don't understand. We're busy making money down here. If we shut the lights off, we make less money, so go to hell. And the government said, okay, keep the lights off. They ordered them to turn the lights off in January. They didn't shut them off till the middle of May. Like, these mayors told the federal government what to do in time of war and got away with it. And it was only it got so bad that tankers were getting sunk from hitting other tankers that had been sunk. There were just so many wrecks. It was really, really sad. And, there's graveyards up and down the East Coast with, bodies of, people from China, sailors from China, British Navy guys, Germans that washed up. It's just amazing. 57 days the tanker burned off Hope Sound, Florida. The woman, Mrs. Scranton, whose family found in Scranton, Pennsylvania, she was writing a memoir at 4 in the morning, and 30 American sailors showed up, so she gave them whiskey and called the local cops. And just all these amazing stories, they're true. This just represents, it's a little fuzzy. These are the 130 ships that were sunk in the area. It's a big area. The Bahamas alone is about 100,000 square miles. And then this whole area to Bermuda and Anegada is 1 million. The reason the Bahamas, the Germans liked the Bahamas because they didn't have to work as hard. Instead of being 100,000 miles to patrol, they just had to patrol a few channels, and everything had to go through those channels. They didn't have radar. It was very, very low tech. Basically had a couple teenagers in a conning tower with a pair of binoculars, and when they saw something like smoke or a stack, they would go after it. It was really, really basic. And the Americans, the lights were on, so that helped. All the lighthouses were working, all the navigation lights. They had a little book called Groner, so they would look at your profile before or after sinking you and match your profile with the type of ship they just sunk. But normally the radio person would realize that they were going to be in a lifeboat for a month, so they would call the details of their ship, to shore. Say, this is the SS, Wildflower, and we're being sunk here. Please come get us. Nobody ever sent an airplane or anything to go get them because they didn't have the airplanes, and the airplanes they had were pretty lousy. But at least they knew sort of where they were, and and if they made it to shore, then they would corroborate. It was really pretty pathetic. In the Bahamas, 6,000 men were thrown in the water. About 1,600 died, and about 300 actually made it, to shore. These are again the same wrecks. There's the area. Yeah, quite a lot of, in Bahamas and Bermuda area, which I sort of mix here, 170 different patrols. So, you have the same guy in a different submarine or the same submarine with a different guy, could attack. So it gets a little confusing, but the fact is, starting in January, they sent as many as they could. There were a few tricks that Churchill played. He successfully convinced Hitler that they were going to invade Norway. So Hitler kept back a dozen subs, or more to protect Norway. Eventually, they did invade Norway. So that saved us, through nothing that we did right, really. And then also, we kept scaring them that the Med was going to be under attack. Germans and Italians controlled most of the Med. The British controlled Gibraltar. So Hitler sent a lot of subs and kept a lot of subs in the Med. So what could have been a complete onslaught and a much bigger disaster ended up being literally, like half a dozen subs at a time. And so they sent the first wave, and then while they were coming back, the second wave would arrive. And one of them, Teddy Surin, was a kind of a rebel. He banged into, he was rendezvousing with a German submarine before he'd actually started to sink ships. And he banged into the other submarine and had to come back to Germany. So when he came back, Dönitz, he didn't say anything to him, he just kicked him in the ass. He's like, you idiot, you made it to the US coast and you banged into your colleague, and rendered yourself useless. This is the Allied response. If anyone can make sense of this, they're much smarter than me. This was our response. This is a strategic defense zone. I think it's called the 7th Naval District North or something. This is the Gulf Sea frontier that goes from the Gulf to the Bahamas, which isn't in the Gulf. This is the Puerto Rico sector. This is the Caribbean sector. This is Panama sector. They didn't talk to each other. So if a ship left this area, no one in this area knew. When a ship left this area, no one in this area knew. No wonder the Germans won, this area of the battle, because this was our answer to their attack. I mean, just doesn't make any sense. This is the first couple weeks. These are the Italians here. Tazzoli, Finzi, Morosini, Torelli. The Italians were notoriously, the Germans wanted the Italians because they had more subs than anyone else at that time in the war, and Hitler hadn't given Dönitz enough time to build enough subs to really deliver a crippling blow. So we were really excited to get the Italian submarines. Unfortunately, they came with submarine officers who didn't follow orders very well. So the German strategy was, if you see a convoy, you hold back until all your colleagues are together, and then you attack together and destroy the convoy. The Italian response was, oh look, a ship, let's sink it. So it didn't really work with the German strategy. So the Germans basically fired them. They took their subs but fired the Italians and sent them on a sort of pretty benign patrol area off the Bahamas, where they sank more ships than any Germans did. They sank one of them, Captain Enrico Tazzoli, the Enrico Tazzoli run by Carlo Pecce di Cassato, sank like 7 ships in a week. And that was the one we just saw the video of. And when he was attacking a ship and was fired on and panicked and dove and hit the ship, which you're normally supposed to hit the ship with a torpedo, not a submarine. And so he was out of the war, but he decided that he would patrol the US coast and just scare people. And it was actually a pretty good tactic. He would just pop up near ships and go like, ah, like open his gun, and they're like, oh my God, we're under attack. And so he did that like 10 times, and like even the Germans like, who the hell is scaring people? Like, there are no German submarines out here. Who is that? And it was like the Italians, So it was a sad ending. He made it back to the Med. They promoted him, gave him a lot of medals, and then his sub went to Japan and was sunk in like the first 2 days, so he was very sad because they died and he didn't. Sort of survivor guilt. And then they sent him to the Med, and they said, okay, stop killing English, start killing Germans and protecting the English. And He's like, what? And so he killed Germans for a few weeks, and then he asked for permission from the king on how to proceed, because his family was the Savoy dynasty, and they'd been killing other people for hundreds of years for the king. And the king said, I'm rather busy right now, we've just given up our government, Mussolini's telling me what to do. And he killed himself. He was really frustrated, because he wasn't getting, he was in prison, and because he refused to fight. And kind of a sad story, but now they have a submarine named after him. He's quite a legend. So this is like the second and third week. I didn't make these maps, and like any map, they're not perfect, but they illustrate the point very well. This is a few weeks later. I mean, by now, if that isn't an assault, I don't know what is. I mean, in what, July to August, in 30 days, you've got like 50 subs. Just unbelievable. Then they backed off. We started fighting back. Says, okay, we'll go somewhere else, or we'll do something else until they forget about us again, and then we'll attack. So then they attacked the Bauxite route again. A very important, not very newsworthy, but slow plodding dry bulk ships. But they went down really quickly, which is quite sad because they were filled with mud and soil. So and then they broadened the attack. The Italians actually made it into the Caribbean as far as Jamaica, but when a sub goes somewhere and doesn't sink anything, it's really easy not to believe it ever happened because there's no evidence. In the Bahamas, we do have two graves. We have an African-American steward that was buried on a remote island, and a Norwegian, 57-year-old Norwegian fisherman that was killed by the Germans. So we do have some physical evidence. Obviously, the Germans, most of their trade with Malaysia, where most of the rubber came from, was cut off, certainly to South America. So if they found rubber, they took it. So they would just comb through the wreckage and find inner tubes that were going to North Africa to help beat Rommel. A lot of the ships were laden with like beer, sausages, artillery, plane parts, going from New York to Suez. But it was everything, oil. I mean, you name it. There was lamb and meat and butter from New Zealand that came through Panama. Any empty ships, full ships, small ships, mail ships. I mean, they were pretty indiscriminate. The problem with the schooners and the smaller ships was the Germans missed a lot. They didn't like to miss because the ships were so high in the water that they made a very poor target. This is a very subjective and very biased opinion, but having read thousands and thousands of these documents, the ones I'm most impressed with are the Nova Scotian and Newfoundlanders and the New England fishermen, because they knew how to survive in little boats, because that's what they did for a living. So they would row and sail for 1,000 miles and think nothing of it, and just walk, sail up to the beach and get off. Whereas the men that were used to living in a huge metal motor ship were less accustomed to surviving in such harsh conditions on small boats. They just weren't. They just didn't have as much experience. The other ones that I have to admire, the Norwegians, they had 1,000 ships that they got out of the Germans' hands. A lot of the time, they would be arrested and living off Morocco, Tunisia, these various anchorages, and in Italy, because they were kind of neutral. Anyway, they would somehow, the Germans would pull a piston, and the Norwegians would figure out how to, I know nothing about mechanics, but they would put a new piston in, and under cover of dark, they would all take off at night. And the Germans had better things to do than to chase a bunch of Norwegian ships. So they would come to New York and they would trade in support of our side, and they were really impressive people. I can't count how many Norwegians in lifeboats refused rescue. No, we don't want to go to South Africa. We want to go to New York. So thanks, just give us some water, we'll be fine. And they did, and they just kept going to New York, And the captain would be like, but you got bleeding men there. You haven't had food in 2 weeks. Come on, let me rescue you. No need. Thanks. It's really amazing, true stories. The Americans figured out that if you went in convoy, you had less chance of losing ships, which is exactly what the British have been saying all along. So Guantanamo was a huge base for
staging.
Yeah, staging, and it was also, they had so many thousands of survivors from different ships that it was really a pain, because its main function was to bring war to the enemy, not to harbor a bunch of civilians, that were complained a lot. Like the British still had the class system, and they would say, I demand not to be sat next to an ordinary seaman. I'm an officer in the Royal. Yeah, what? You put me on a bus with sailors, and I'm an officer. Come on, guys, get over yourselves, But those are the kind of letters they got. Hemingway was getting sloshed every night and writing the U.S. Navy in Key West saying I'm going to go get a German U-boat, and they're like, just leave us alone. They gave a 25-year-old intern the job of answering Mr. Hemingway's drunken phone calls at every hour of the day, just to like shut him up. He had a plan that he was going to somehow board a submarine with a grenade and sink the submarine. Yeah, not the brightest person, but made him into a bit of a rock star, I guess. This is the Athol Queen. 3 men were rowing ashore and drowned. I learned as a sailor that if you're on shore and there's a reef in front of you, you hear and see the waves, but if you're approaching a reef from behind it, you can't see or hear the reef. And these guys learned it the hard way. So a lot of lifeboats, they'd approach land after a long voyage, and you don't hear or see anything. You get carried over the wave onto the reef, and suddenly you're in trouble. So that's what happened. 3 of them tried to swim ashore and didn't make it, and were never found. There's a nice little memorial there to them. A guy in the island of Hopetown, Abaco, Elbow Key, tried very hard to find the story, but couldn't because he never realized it was an Italian, not a German submarine. So there's the bow of the Italian submarine there. That's all bent. So it can't fire torpedoes. It did make it back to Europe. But basically, this bow sank, hit that ship. This is Mr. Heald, Alan Heald. I spoke to him in England. I tried to visit as many survivors as I could because basically they're all dead now. But I spoke to him and I learned a bit about him. And I said, hey, what happened? Like after he got sunk in the Bahamas, he had a baby crib and all this stuff for his wife who was pregnant. She had like preeclampsia or something. She was going to die at birth, and so he had all this baby stuff. And he managed to get it back to her. Of course, it all sank, and then he bought new stuff and got it to England. Apparently, he got sunk on 2 other ships just trying to get to England. And I said, hey, Alan, tell me about that. He said, I will never tell you. I will never tell anyone. And when he got to England, they said, you can't possibly do anything functional. They put him in like a radio room to tinker with magnets because he was a wreck. But he was alive when I last spoke to him. So I did a little presentation on lighthouses. There were a couple of unique things. There was a U.S. blimp that very bravely and against standing orders attacked the U-boat, which is pretty much what U.S. blimps were supposed to do. They had never used the bomb release, so that when they dove in to attack and came under fire, and they released the depth charge, it didn't release. So that when the Germans shot them down and they hit the water, they started swimming for their lives because the depth charge was going to blow up when they hit a certain depth. So they all swam away from the blimp, and the commander of the U-boat, a guy named Grossen, took his submarine up to the blimp and cut material because he wanted to bring it back to Germany to analyze. And the guys made it to an island, but one of them didn't, Isidor Strassel. So not only was it the only U.S. Navy blimp sunk by a U-boat in World War II, but he was also the only U.S. Navy blimp crew killed by a German U-boat in World War II, and that happened off the Bahamas, Kiesau. This is the battle between the O.A. Knudsen, the Norwegian ship, and I'll just try to simplify it. The Germans sank a bunch of ships off of Florida. Canaveral was very popular to sink ships because they had to go around this bend. And then he went here, and he was going to go into the Bahamas. But he found this German tanker, so he attacked. And what should have been sort of a 2-hour operation turned into a 2-day operation. It was a massive German-built tanker, one of the largest in the world at the time. And so the Norwegians kept fighting back. And so the Norwegian put all the injured on a lifeboat, and then the captain, Olaf Brigadal, whose family I'm in touch with, said, okay, let's get out of here, boys. So he fired up the engines and started sailing away, even though they'd been hit by 2 torpedoes. And the German had just lined up an attack and fired his torpedoes when the Norwegians took off, so the torpedoes missed. So now the German was really upset, so he's following the tanker, and he sank like 7, he used all his torpedoes in sinking this tanker. And at the end of it, he looked in his book and said, no wonder it was German. Well, the Norwegians said, kept sending maydays. Hey, hey guys, we're fighting off the Germans, and we think we can make it. We're heading to Abaco. Come and get us. We know you have airplanes in Florida. Come and rescue us. Come on. And nothing came. And they were used to being in the English Channel or the North Sea, where if you call for help, people show up. So they were really upset, the Norwegians, because they kept risking their lives they were pumping gasoline out of the tanks to put in the lifeboats, and they would linger and then get back on the ship and then go. They lasted for 24 hours, and nobody got. A Frenchman got killed in a lookout crow's nest, And then the old Norwegian from Svalbard died on shore and was buried there. And there was one sort of blemish on the Norwegian record because they ended up in a lumber camp, and the local authorities, Duke of Windsor, said, "We're sending a yacht to rescue you, grab all your men and come back to Nassau and we'll take care of you." Well, this guy, they sent a nurse and the doctor, and the nurse and doctor said, "This guy's too sick to move on a yacht." And so the Norwegians left him, and he died 2 days later. So nobody knew what to do with him, so they just threw him in a local graveyard. And then, of course, a lumber camp, when it's cut all the lumber, they're not going to wait 30 years for it to grow back, so they take off. So he was abandoned. There was I've been to his grave, and I went with the Norwegian TV program, we found his grave, and there's no one there. There's the captain. There's Captain Knut Olav Bringendal. It's his first officer. This is Ulrich Heis, the commander of the U-boat, U-128. He survived the war. This is Olaus. His full name is Olaus Edvard Martin Gams Johansen. He was born on Seagull Island in North Norway, an impoverished fishing community, and went to Svalbard when the war started getting thick, and then the British attacked Svalbard, so he went to England. It just so happens that there was this tanker, the Knudsen, the owners of whom are still in business in Haugesund, Norway, and two kids got rip-roaring drunk on New Year's Eve and didn't show up in time for the ship to leave. So they grabbed a couple fill-ins who just wanted to hitchhike across the Atlantic, and they arrived in Liverpool. The fill-ins took off, and the captain, Bringendal, said, "Damn it, I've got 2 vacancies and I need to fill it." So he just grabbed this 57-year-old fisherman from Norway who was in the right space at the right time, and took off for Texas, Port Arthur. They loaded in Port Arthur, went through the Bahamas, got sunk, and this guy is now buried right here. We found, by the way, I spent 3 years looking for his grave, and we walked past the gravesite a few times, and this boat captain that we hired said, "These are the kind of trees that we use to bury people. Like, it's a way of marking that someone's buried here." And I said, "Really?" And so we looked and we found the headstones. And I said, "What do we do now?" He said, "Well, in the Bahamas, we always bury the feet facing east. So if I were you, I would look on the east side of the headstone, not the west." So we dug on the east side of the headstone, we found a flower pot. It was really very moving. People were crying. His granddaughters were with us. It was like in Bay National News in Norway. It was kind of a big deal. So we dedicated the beach. There is a sign on the beach now saying, "This beach is in memory of Olaus." So, and no one had any clue. I found his death certificate. I mean, no one had any clue about this guy. This is the Italian operations. It's just evidence that the Italians completely intended to attack the Bahamas. I met an older man now that was a child that witnessed them being brought ashore. A fisherman and his wife cooked, I guess, 30 cups of coffee in like the space of an hour. They took turns, and then they took turns using the only truck, like to get to the town. So it's quite an amazing story. This is let's see. That's Carlo Fecce di Casato, the one who killed himself. This is the Dutch ship that we saw being sunk, the Lighthouse. This is an amazing story, and I'm turning this into a script because it's so extraordinary. The script has actually been to Hollywood, and they were going to run with it, but then, I'm not very knowledgeable, but Eddie Rickenbacker and the fellow from Unbroken, Louis Zamperetti, and all these other people sort of made longer survival stories, and in the math of Hollywood, like, go with the story with the 59-day lifeboat trip, not the 39-day, So this was an amazing story of George Weyerhaeuser, the lumber company in Seattle, decided that he left Chicago, he bought a bunch of land in Idaho. Potlatch is when a rich guy lays out an Indian, Native American, gives all his or her possessions in front of the tent so that the neighbors can help themselves as a way of sort of leveling, they call it socialism, I think. Anyway, so what happened was, Weyerhaeuser joked, he's like, "This is my way of giving my wealth away because I invested in ships." They say if you want to make a small fortune in shipping, start with a big one. They had 2 cadets. It's the only military academy in the world, in the United States, where the cadets go into war while being cadets. I don't think, from what I'm told, West Point and Annapolis and Fort Collins don't do that. So I think they had a number of cadets killed. And these 2 cadets, Kaplan and Carbati. Interesting story, sign of the times. I'm friends with both of their relatives, but Carbati couldn't get into Annapolis because he had an Italian name, and the senator wouldn't write a letter in support. So he got into Merchant Marine Academy instead. And Kaplan changed his name to Stark and became like the head of Hallmark Cards. So like, it's sign of the times. Like, who would have thunk? But they both survived the war. Basically, the ship was sunk by Reichman, whose dad was a vicar in rural Prussia. And apparently Reichman had a conscience, for what it's worth, because when he had an accident and the two U-boats collided during training in the Baltic, they both sank to the bottom. And at the last minute, the Reichmans popped up and they all lived and the other guys all died. So Reichman had a nervous breakdown. He was in the hospital for 30 days. I read his military records. Every commander is supposed to come up with a sort of a slogan for like, let's go out and kill the enemy. And he chose, of all things, he said, strike brightly and smiling and do harm. It was like the most optimistic attack slogan. It's kind of like, be nice to people. And he lived up to the motto because he killed many more Germans than he killed Allies. I think he sank 3 ships, which resulted in like 3 or 4 Allied deaths, and yet he 50 men on his boat were killed, and the 50 men on the other boat that he sank, were killed. So his tally was 100 Germans to 3 Allies. So here is the Taisa that was sunk by an Italian, and the 2 lifeboats bumped into each other in the middle of the ocean, and the Americans had like 3 rafts and a lifeboat, and they were all excited, like there's a sail, and we're rescued, and this is great, and the Dutch, I have the Dutch logbook, Regeveen, sails up to this American, lifeboat. And he's like, hey guys, how you doing? Who are you? Oh, we're the Potlatch. Okay, land is about 100 miles south. Good luck. And he takes off. And and sails away. And the Americans are like, you jerk. There were like 10 Dutch in like a 40-foot lifeboat and 50 Americans in a 26-foot lifeboat, like literally sleeping on top of each other with wounded and dying and shark bites and starving. And these Dutch just took off. And of course, the Americans thought they were like Germans and Nazis. And it was very bad for morale. Of course, the Dutch did actually tell, when they arrived in St. Martin the next day, they said, hey, we found the Potlatch lifeboat and she's just 100 miles north of here, maybe you should go find them. But they never did. The planes that they saw were like just, Pan Am, really high altitude. Anyway, they made it because of misnavigation. Captain Jack LaPointe missed the Bahamas, missed the Caribbean, ended up in the Bahamas. These are just photos of the ship. This is an amazing photo. Someone from the Coast Guard went through all the ships at anchor in New York Harbor and documented them, knowing that probably the last time we see them, and it was. This was the last photo of the Potlatch. This is water tanks, for the desert. Fill them with water, bring them to the troops, follow the troops. But because of it, people thought that it was carrying tanks, which it wasn't. I mean, it was carrying water tanks, but they thought it was tanks. So you can see they've got the little bucket turrets up here. They converted it. So there's Captain Jack LaPointe. His nose was broken by a wire. He was the last to leave the ship, and as the ship rolled over, he was tangled up in all the wires. And so he's really lucky to have survived. And I think he's carrying a bunch of papers too. So the first thing, when he popped up from the sunk ship alive, he handed over command to the first mate. He was bleeding, he was coughing up blood, his ribs were broken, he was in really bad shape. Kind of a tough guy. He was from Baltimore. He was actually from Havistraw, which is right near here, right? Yes. Amazing story. He's from Havistraw. His parents weren't able to raise him, so they sent him to Fall River, and he was raised by an aunt. He went to sea at 15. He married a girl in Wales when he was like 18, which his family didn't know about until I told them. That was a little awkward. And then he made his home in Baltimore, married Adele, raised a family in Baltimore, and was a captain of a number of ships. And he was an amazing guy. He got the highest praise from the authorities in Nassau for keeping the crew disciplined. They didn't go running through the streets pinching girls' bottoms, and they were under control and well behaved. This is Dorsey Librand, a civilian lawyer who, interesting guy, became a senator, big time lawyer. There was a major politician, Storm Thurmond. They were law partners. So when I went to meet one of the kind of GI guys that got recruited at age 16, I told him, hey, you're the head of the gunners. He became a politician and a lawyer. And the response was, it figures. So I love that, because Librand said to my buddy, Jatho there, who's now dead, but who I interviewed, he said, hey, Jago, get the damn light, fetch this, because the moment they landed on shore, no one could walk. And they didn't anticipate that, so they all fell out of the lifeboat and they're trying to crawl onto the beach, And the head of the gunners told the junior gunner to do some meaningless task, and Jado used very colorful language in replying to him, the gist of which was no. So these are just local newspaper clips. This is an interesting story. This guy, Jensen, was used for propaganda, survived in a lifeboat 30 days, and this guy, Skank, wrote the story and a manuscript that was subsequently rejected. He became a missionary in Tahiti. I contacted the son in Tahiti, who was half Tahitian, and I asked him to find the dad's manuscript, and he said, it's in a warehouse, it's the rainy season, you're going to have to pay me to get it. I'm like, I'll pay you to get the damn manuscript. So I got the manuscript. So these are the, 7-week wonders. They take you out of high school, and 7 weeks later you go on a ship and fight Germans. That's basically after their little course. Dempsey Ruggles, I don't know which one, but I met two of those guys. One day I woke up and said, if I don't go where these men live, like Garrison, Kentucky, and St. Louis, and meet them like this weekend, I'm never going to meet them. And so I did. I just flew out there for the day. They made me a Midwestern lunch. I got to meet them, asked them what it was like to look at a Nazi who's holding a gun at you in the middle of the ocean, and that alone made it worth it. And I went home. So I'm glad I did, because they're all dead. This is Parson. He has no family. He'd been a cook. He lived in Bronx and Brooklyn, lived with his sister, Baltimore, sort of bounced around. I wish I could find his family, but he died in the arms of the captain within sight of land under the lighthouse after 30 days at sea. And the captain wrote a death certificate. He said, relationship to deceased. And obviously he's an African-American, probably the lowest ranking person on the ship. And the captain said, friend. I just thought that was so sweet. All racial, class, officer barriers broken. They were friends. And he made sure that Parson got a good burial. So, and the locals were pretty happy to help because they felt he was one of their own. I've spoken to Paleologos' relatives. He was his leg was badly smashed by the torpedo attack. He got into a lifeboat, and as often happens, even with the El Faro last year, the lifeboats didn't work. So one rope would release and the other would stay taut, so that everything in the lifeboat would just spill out like meat off a skewer. So he fell in the water, and because he was so badly injured, he couldn't help himself. Jensen, who you saw recently, grabbed one of his ankles and was holding on to him, but I guess Jensen was holding on to a rope, and the water going into the hole in the ship made by the torpedo was so strong that something had to give, and he let go of Paleologos' leg. Paleologos was sucked into the belly of the ship and never seen again. So very traumatic, for Paleologos' family and also for Jensen. So here is their motto: be bright, cheerful, and strike them hard. Amazing. And the Americans reported, this is you can see it here. There's the Viking shield, there's the axe, and there's the dragon. I mean, there it is, and the Americans told the Navy, we saw an axe with a sword, and just unbelievable. So I looked into Reichman's history. Nobody had done so. By the way, if you call an American family and say, hey, your granddad served in the war, can you tell me? Oh, sure, come on down, we'll have coffee, I'll send you photos. Germany, they hang up. Oh, your granddad, served as a German submarine commander. No email, no. I've never gotten a single reply. The German Record Division, they'll help you. This is in what's now Poland. Szczecin, used to be Stettin. I've had merchant mariners send me photos of this base. You can still see the walls. This is the program that they were supposed to follow: New York, Trinidad to get oil, Cape Town, Suez. That was the basic plan. But the oil engine didn't work very well, so they ended up here for a week. I tracked. There were like 8 submarines that could have sunk them between here and there, and some submarines actually saw them. I mean, it was unbelievable. So it was a matter of time before they got sunk. The captain thought he would outsmart the submarines by going a little east of the prescribed route, and he confided in Carbati, whose children I met. His son-in-law was the second in command of the Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy. Daughter was in the U.S. Navy, and so he said, "Hey, look, kid, I'm going to outsmart those Nazis." Well, it didn't work. They got sunk. And then obviously they never made it here, and they drifted there. It's an amazing story. I don't want to spend too much time on just one story. These are drawings from a propaganda magazine about what happened. Oil spouting off the ship. The Germans interrogating them on the rafts. Sometimes they would bring Americans on board. Sometimes take them as POWs. Particularly if it was a neutral situation and they wanted to protect themselves by having a Uruguayan captain prove that he didn't have his lights on, he didn't have his, all that stuff. So, but in this case, they didn't. They did offer some basic supplies, really horrible cigarettes, ersatz cigarettes, and then basic stuff, blankets. The Americans actually said we don't need anything, and you got a bunch of teenage kids that had just been attacked, being challenged by young kids with machine guns. So there wasn't a lot of love lost between the two. LaPointe, takes over. They tow these 4 rafts. I'll kind of skim through this. There's a guy named John Miller, whose nickname was Stinky for some movie character at the time, who got bitten by a shark and sort of went crazy and started drinking iodine. For the sake of the men, you almost wish he'd sort of... They caught the shark and they brought it and they were wrestling with it and he was trying to be a hero. You almost wish he died right away, because for the next week he died very slowly and in a very confined space, and it was very, very bad for morale. Eventually he died and they buried him. Very sad. This is the gentleman who sank the German sub. The German sub, for some reason, attacked that little thing, which is like a minesweeper. It had like a 6-foot draft, and the submarine, failed to sink it, not surprisingly, and was viciously counterattacked. Smedberg, it's really the interesting histories. I think Smedberg went on to be like the coach of the Annapolis football team. So all these really interesting sub-stories. This is, Lighthouse. Parson is buried on the right, which I think is very sweet. He's got a permanent burial. This is Reverend Newton Williamson, who I met years ago, a local patriarch, and he was a child. If anyone's heard of Campari, the key ingredient of Campari is from, the only place in the world it comes from is this island of Athens. It's called cascarilla bark. And the ladies and men get on their hands and knees and they shave the bark off this bush, and then they put it in a sack and they soak it in water for a few weeks, and then they put it on the mailboat. It's just amazing. So the adults were all catching cascarilla to make a living, and the kids were being looked after by a young girl, and they were called by her, and they were called down to help these like naked sailors, and the sailors had to crawl. They had no vehicles. A yacht had sunk on this island, run aground on this island. The yacht Time O'Shine. It was British Navy officers that were using a yacht cruise as a pretext to spy on Japanese islands. This is a diversion, but they did spy on Japanese islands, as yachtsmen. Made it to the Bahamas, ran aground, and they tried to dig the yacht off the sandbar. The locals would not loan their shovel. There was one shovel on the island, and they needed it to bury their dead. So that gives you an idea of how rich these people were. They did not have a lot. The captain bought every item in their food store. It was 19 cans of peaches, 7 packs of cigarettes, whatever it was. He bought them all. Romilda Cox, she's amazing. She keeps the records. The head of the church was Reverend Colley. He owned the only sailboat in town, and it's an amazing story that go on. Anyway, this is I'm not afraid to say it, she's a lesbian. She's a world-renowned yacht racer. She grew up in what's now a country club in Mamaroneck, the Standard Oil family. Carstairs wasn't the original name, I'll think of it. Anyway, it's a true story. Her mother was an alcoholic drug addict. She had like 3 different stepfathers. She inherited the money from the rich father, and the mother tried to get it. So she had a fake marriage to a gay friend of hers, male, and so they got married, and then they took different cars away from the church. And so she's an amazing woman, and she in World War II she drove ambulances. In World War I she drove ambulances. She also went back to the battlefield after the war to bury the dead from both sides. Very few people did that. The only ones that did it, from what I understand, are African Americans that were forced to do it by the military. She volunteered to do it. She had an all-women garage in London called the X Garage. We're all adults here. She slept with Marlene Dietrich, Tallulah Bankhead, Oscar Wilde's niece. She had 40 trophy women that she slept with, and she had portraits of each one in her mansion. She inherited a lot of money. She didn't like being taxed. Like my father, she went to the Bahamas. She bought 3 islands. She had her own little army. She had her own church. She had her own estate. She built yachts. This is Virgmere. And she said to the admiral of the British Navy, he said, "Sir, I am an expert race boater." She set world records, and people used her boats to set world records. And I build boats. I can do everything. What do you want me to do to help you win this war? And he said, "Wrong sex, wrong war." So that was not much help. So when she heard that these Americans were floundering around in southern Bahamas and needed urgent help, she hopped in her speedboat and she rescued them. And one of my favorite quotes is she landed in a nest of boat handlers, and they said when this boat came over the horizon and and came up alongside the little schooner, you could have kept an egg between her boat and their boat, and it wouldn't have been crushed. That's how good a boat handler she was. And she rescued them. That was the good news. The bad news was they had gotten their first food and water in 30 days, a few days before. So suffice to say, they made a horrible mess of her deck. They weren't in the best shape. It made it to, believe it or not, Ripley's Believe It or Not. By the way, they said, and the men that were rescued had no idea that the skipper was a woman because she was so macho. I've been at sea for long periods of time. You know when there's a woman within a mile of you after you've been at sea for 30 days. I don't care how many tattoos they have. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not. This is the Duchess of Windsor. As they arrived, Carboni, his daughter, told me he refused to be photographed with facial hair. So they said, the AP said, hey, come on, boys, line up, we'll get a photo. No, I got to shave first. I got to comb my hair. So he ran into the bathroom, did a quick shave and a haircut, or whatever, combed his hair. And there, he's the only one that's shaven. So, yeah, this is Kaplan from Kings Point over in Long Island. Obviously, he lost a lot of weight. So, Sorensen, I think that's Jackson, and he's a Danish officer. But it's a true, I mean, it's an amazing story. Duchess of Windsor, if you probably all know her, but a couple little factoids. When she was born in Virginia, they would not give a gender. In today's era, we can talk openly about it. The doctor was not confident enough of her identity, male or female, that he refused to document her gender. So, very interesting woman. She married, and she was a good name, I forget, very fancy name in American aristocracy, but no money. So she went to like Emma Willard or something, and like lived in a tenement house. So she knew the good and the bad. She was pretty tough. She was very close to her Aunt Bessie, who she wrote pretty much every day. She married an abusive alcoholic who was in the U.S. Air Force. He used to beat her up and get drunk all the time, and he took her to the Air Force base in like Pensacola, Florida, I think, and she watched so many men die in aircraft wrecks that she was forever afraid of flying. So she would take the boat to and from the Bahamas when her governor, basically her husband was accused of siding with Nazis, so Churchill banished them to the Bahamas, where the previous governor, who was very popular, was subsequently banished to Kampala, Uganda. So that wasn't really a promotion for him. But anyway, the Duchess, did an amazing job. People maligned her, but in the Bahamas she did a really good job of looking after these Allied sailors that came into her jurisdiction. And one typical example was this really exists today, the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the British Empire, controlled what happened to Allied personnel in the Bahamas. And so they told her, whatever you do, Duchess, there's to be no drinking. These men may not drink while they're in the Bahamas because they can pinch girls' bottoms, they're going to throw up in the streets, they're going to cause noise and riots, they're going to get in fights. And the Duchess said, really? You're sitting here on your lazy asses doing nothing behind the lines, and these guys are on the front lines. They just survived being sunk by the enemy, and we're going to send them next week where they're going to be sunk again and probably won't survive. If they want to drink when they're on my island, they will drink. And she opened a canteen, free booze for all the sailors, as long as they're on it. I really admire her. I mean, she's amazing. So, it was probably the only job she ever held, but, she did a really good job at it. These are various places in Nassau. This would mean something to those of you who go to Nassau. There's Governor's House. They sent a limo to pick up the gunnery officer and Captain LaPointe. They flew them home, which is unusual. All the others, had to take a freighter. In fact, the Greeks that were sunk were 2 days from sharing the wooden freighter with Sidney Poitier. Sidney Poitier was from a rural island in the Bahamas with not enough food and not enough farming. And it was so bad that they put the siblings in different buildings. There were so few people, they didn't want incest, and it was a really crazy way to grow up. And he was taking a boat to the United States, where his mother happened to give birth to him when the father was a sharecropper. So anyway, he was emigrating to America a few days before the Greeks emigrated to America. And they waived a lot of the paperwork for Allied survivors. In Halifax, there was famously a table that said, survivors only. Like everyone else had to eat somewhere else, but this was only for the guys that just got off the boat. And there was a case of a Caribbean schooner that arrived in Halifax with black Caribbean sailors and a German Shepherd. And they were refused entry at the hotel because of the dog, the blacks, or both. And so, the Captain Lewis Kennedy, who grew up in what's now the Stanford Yacht Club in Connecticut, grabbed the guy by the neck and said, "We just survived the sinking, and we're going to stay here, and all of us are going to stay here." And yeah, that's the way it's going to be. Anyway, there's the Duchess and the Duke. These are my buddies, Jake and Dempsey. First time they saw each other in 70 years, they got their medals back. Nobody had remembered, even their kids, like didn't know really what they'd gone through. 30 days in a lifeboat. Jake refuses to eat seafood, and once at a dinner party, somebody said, "Oh, Mr. Dempsey, what, you don't like my seafood?" He said, "Man, after you saw what I saw, like raw fish and guts for 30 days, you wouldn't like seafood either." So it's an amazing story. So this is just data. This is that was the schooner that Captain Kennedy. They were having breakfast and they heard this, and Shug, who had set the torpedo, sent it too low. So they were made aware that someone was shooting at them in the middle of the ocean. So they got into a lifeboat. The Captain Kennedy, who subsequently moved to the Bahamas, and I know his kids and grandkids, he asked the German commander for a tow to land. To which the commander said, "You've got balls," and then took off. So it didn't work. This is Patsy Bowling, who I grew up with her kids, looking at, the James E. Newsom, and both ships were sunk by U-boats in World War II. I mean, what's the economic value of sinking a schooner? I don't know. They were carrying like piggins of molasses, like weird cargoes, salt, donkey, weird stuff. But they got sunk, and they're beautiful schooners. Newsom, this is one being built. I've got to wind it up soon. The Irene Forsyth, that's I'll skip to the next slide. This is the summary. In Old Saybrook, Connecticut, not far from here, some ambitious young Ivy League naval enlistees, whatever, decided they were going to convert a condemned schooner that was laid up, had been sold anyway, and so they did. They put some time and money into fixing up this old schooner, and they went off to Bermuda to win the war. Well, it didn't make it to Bermuda, and they had to spend a lot of time, towing it to Bermuda and then to New York. And the conclusion by the Navy was, this is quote unquote, "The failure to ascertain prior to or during conversion that the vessel was unseaworthy is an indication of professional incompetence on the part of the officers concerned." I've never had the privilege of serving in the military or representing my country. I don't think you want that on your file. Carmen, when I was studying this, the Churio was a schooner that was sunk off Dominican Republic. When I learned that a schooner named Churio had been sunk, I said, I want to know who sank that, and I hope I was on the other side. I want to know, I don't want to sympathize with anyone who sank a boat called Churio. I mean, who does that? Come on. But they sank it, and it being America, it was the only vessel out of 130 where the sailors who were rescued by the United States Navy said, "Hey man, you owe me for the shirts and the diaries and the beer that I had, my personal stuff, you got to pay me now." I don't think the Navy was amused. There was a case of the enemy bombing, an island off Puerto Rico where some Boy Scouts were sleeping. There was no enemy anywhere near, and it was obviously some allies testing their weapons, and they had no idea that the island was occupied by Boy Scouts. So that one's kind of mysteriously dropped off the record. There was another ship that was allegedly sunk by U-boats, but there's no U-boat anywhere near, and that was because it was an insurance write-off. They figured, they just claimed it was sunk by a U-boat, nobody would notice, but I did notice. Another sailboat. This one ended up. This was on the Canadian dollar bill and ended up being repurposed by the Cubans when the wreck floated up in Cuba. The Gertrude, it's kind of interesting. You'll read about this in the Hemingway patrols, the book about Hemingway. The captain, Coleman, sank the Gertrude, which he really shouldn't have done because that was his wife's name. And they managed to follow all his attacks. It was like a tiny little boat. They followed his attacks until they sank him off New Orleans when he sank the Robert E. Lee, I think. And then they found the BP or someone found the wreck of the submarine when they were surveying. So it's a really amazing story. That wasn't. And then Captain Walter Broward Crossland. He had swordfish and onions. Not a really valuable cargo. And they had a little motorboat, and they motored to Key West. But they ran out of gas. Civil Air Patrol rescued them. Beautiful boat. This boat was a sister ship to one sunk off Turks and Caicos, and she had donkeys on deck, which nobody really mentions, but they didn't make it. So, they were trying to get rid of the donkeys on the island, so they would put them on schooners and just tell them to take them somewhere else. I hired a guy to find out what happened to the men in Turks and Caicos, and he sent me all these pictures. These are the actual buildings where these people were rescued and treated, like officers on the right and sailors in the schoolhouse on the left.
Yeah.
So it's really amazing. I hope it survived the hurricane. This is an amazing story. There was Captain William Pond was a Harvard graduate who bought a yacht like in Harvard in graduate school. Anyway, long story, him and his wife started teaching kids how to like get into Harvard, like while they were sailing. It was kind of a cool concept. Anyway, I tracked like 8 of his vessels because I'm in the New York Yacht Club, and a lot of them were owned by former members. So what he was in the habit of doing is he didn't have a lot of money, but he was very creative. He would get a bunch of students to sign up on his latest boat and then teach them for a couple months, maybe a couple of years. Normally the boat would wreck or he would fail to pay the bills, and then he would borrow money from one of the students' parents to pay off the first boat, and then buy a second boat and take a second batch out for a couple of years until he ran out of money or the boat sank, and then he would do it over and over and over. He did it about 8 times, so it was amazing. So this is an Italian-built schooner that was built in Lucempopolo, Italy, and was a lawsuit for like 50 years because apparently some Boston Brahmin said, build me the best yacht in the world. Well, the Italians did. And he's like, you have to destroy the plans when you're done. Well, the Italians didn't. So as soon as the boat won all these records, other people said, can you build me the same yacht? And they said, of course we can. So they did. So this was a knockoff. And it won all kinds of records and ended up wrecking in somewhere in the Caribbean. So here's a conclusion. If you remember nothing else, and for me, obviously, it's the human interest. I like standing up to David, with my little Goliath. Goliath was a monster.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I like to beat it. Anyway, I like to take pot shots at the powers that be. But if you remember nothing else, it is that it was a 1 million square battlefield between Key West and Anegada, Bermuda and Savannah that no one really knew about or mapped or tracked. So that's the takeaway is you can still find a 1 million square mile battlefield in World War II that nobody has owned. And I say owned because in the historical community, and I'm not a professional historian, is that that's the way it works. You stake your turf and say, this is going to be my turf, and if you want something from it, I'll give it to you, but I want something from your area. And you develop all these friendships and trades and barters. You don't actually spend money a lot of times. You take people to lunch, you visit them when you're traveling, you're nice to them, give them credit in your book. So it's a really fascinating. But the fact is that 75 years later, there's still a lot to learn. And particularly, of course, we won the war, and of course, America prevailed. But we did it at great cost, and we made mistakes. And I'm trying to get recognition for some pilots that sank a U-boat in World War II. And I sat with the number 3 guy in the Navy, retired, and he said that was an embarrassment. This period of World War II was an embarrassment to the Navy, and that's how the educated naval officers feel. We got it wrong. We failed to listen to the advice. We failed to allocate the assets, and a lot of people died as a result of our mistakes. And they actually call it the Battle of Washington, a very fierce battle of wills that went on for many months between. It was a blame game. It was his fault. It was her fault. It was his fault. And meanwhile, these guys, were dying every day. So hopefully we can learn from it because there's a lot to learn. And just because we can't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen. All this stuff happened far from shore. The ship sank in really deep water. I spoke to a U-boat commander before he died as well, Herbert Werner, who wrote Iron Coffins. And he said to me, I said, sir, I only want to know one thing. Did any of you guys ever step foot in the Bahamas? That's all I want to know. Did you step foot in Bahamas in World War II? He said, absolutely not. He said, we were scared to death. We had one pair of clothes that was filthy and stank to high heaven, so we wouldn't have gone ashore. It was shallow water. We were terrified of the shallow water. We didn't want to go where the airplanes could see us, and the Bahamas are very clear. And then last of all, I said, oh, but come on. You were found with movie stubs and newspapers from, that's the story. He said, we were kids. If we interacted with men in lifeboats, if we went on board a ship that hadn't sunk yet, we took souvenirs for our families, for our girlfriends, for our parents. We were kids. That's what we did. We didn't see a movie in New York. What are you kidding? What a stupid idea. But we took souvenirs, So, there's always a counterpoint. You always learn. And the last thing I would say is kind of inspirational is that, how did I end up doing this? If you take a topic that's obscure enough, up there it looks like a thimble, like the use of thimbles in Lebanon in the 1890s, and start a website, thimbles Levant 1890s and write one article. You are now the world expert on thimbles in Lebanon in the 1890s. So that's what I did. I said, okay, this is my turf and I'm going to run with it. And nobody stopped me, so it's fine. There were a couple people that said, if you use his name on your site and my name on the same site, I'm not going to allow you to use my name. So I had to navigate all these different factions. But the result are a bunch of books. And this is just something I thought was nice. This was the difference between life and death. That was a British, they gave these on all the lifeboats. It was the little tiny vial that it's a dipper, and you would dip it into the cask of water and pull it out. And twice a day you'd get your ounce or ounce and a half, and that was like an ounce. And so you'd get that little vial and you would drink it in the morning, and you drink your ounce at night, and that's what kept you alive. And for a lot of these men, that little vial made the difference between life and death. So, thank you for your time.
Did you ever meet Clive Cussler?
I didn't meet him, and if I did, I would tell him to look for the French submarine Surcouf. The Surcouf was the largest submarine ever built at the time. She could launch 2 airplanes. She had about 200 men, and had bakeries and all this different stuff. And she was proceeding. I'm not good with French history. Vichy French. Anyway, she was on our side when she came. I know she went to Bermuda, and then she was going to Panama. And now you had a lot of trigger-happy young men in airplanes and submarines and Navy ships that couldn't wait to get their hands on a German submarine. So along comes this French submarine, and nobody really, knew the difference, and they sank it. Now, no one knows where, when, or how it was sunk. They think it was a U.S. merchant ship that was coming out of Panama and saw a sub as the Surcouf was going into Panama and rammed it, or somehow gunned it and sank it. So I'd love to ask Clive Cussler, where is the Surcouf? Because it's an amazing. The Japanese, by the way, also had submarines that had 2 airplanes embedded in them, and they were planning to attack Panama at the same time. People don't get it because the dates are different in our calendar, but at noon in Japan, Emperor Hirohito, I think, was delivered the news that we have just attacked, let me try to get all of it right, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Hawaii, there were more, Indonesia, basically 6 or 7 countries, Australia, at the same moment, Tokyo time. They were going to add Panama, and they thought, that might be stretching us too thin, which was probably right. But people obsess about Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a multi-pronged attack with targets. And what happened in Hong Kong, particularly to the British women as a result of the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong, was so bad that the standing policy was thereafter every ounce of alcohol would be poured out before the Japanese could get to the city. I won't say anymore. Sorry. Yeah?
How long could the Italian and Germans U-boats stay on station? It's a long haul from Europe. And were there any resupply ships in the area?
I'm really glad you asked that because I was supposed to answer that in the beginning. So the Americans, like the British, for example, I lived in Singapore 3 years and read a lot about that campaign. The British captured a Zero. The Zero was actually like a Mitsubishi 543 aircraft, but they didn't know how to speak Japanese, so they just called it like 1, 2, 3, like 0, 1, 2, So they said, oh, this couldn't be a real Japanese aircraft because their eyes are too small to know how to fly them. So they just ignored all the intelligence. So the Americans had intelligence that a German submarine could only make it from France to the Bahamas, spend a day, and go back to France. So therefore, like, how could they possibly be attacking Panama and all these other places? They don't have the capacity to do it. So they've got to have some third arm, like supplying them. Some Swedish guys in the Bahamas got to have barrels of oil that they're rolling out to the sub. That was a failure of the imagination. The Germans converted and I'm not an engineer, the Germans converted their water tanks to fuel tanks. That was step 1. They put double the amount of food, which meant that the men had to share, instead of 1 man per bunk, it was 2 men per bunk. One went on duty, the other, the hot bunking. And then the most ingenious thing they did, they only had 2 toilets, and if you turned the valve the wrong way, the contents covered you in effluent. In a best case, in a worst case, it sank the submarine. Because how do you screw the valve back down when you've got thousands of gallons coming at you at high rate of speed? And then the third thing they did, which was really ingenious, was they went. I'm not an engineer, but they went slow ahead on like the electric motor and like half ahead on the diesel. However they did it, they doubled They doubled their endurance or reduced their consumption by half. Either way. So that's one way they did it. The other thing is they built what were called milk cows. It's milk coup, and they had hospitals on the milk cows. They had all the navigational equipment. They had bakeries. They had anything you wanted if you were a sailor in the middle of the Atlantic. It was basically a floating gas station. They had thousands of tons of oil, and they were generally run by World War I veterans that were very knowledgeable and were kind of father figures to the younger officers. And they would just resupply these guys on the way in and the way out. And if someone like Teddy Surin, who banged into another boat, had to go back without using his torpedoes, he would be sent to give torpedoes to another boat and give fuel to another boat. So the answer to your question is, they took a 3,000 range submarine and turned it into a 6 or 7 or 8 or 9,000 mile range submarine through a combination of ingenuity and then fooling their enemy, us, which if you can do that, obviously accrues to your benefit in a significant way. Plus, like, we were as busy blaming each other as we were fighting the Germans. It's like that was a win-win for the Germans. But the Germans used another ingenious strategy that Nimitz used in the Pacific. Again, I'm not an expert in the Pacific, but my dad told me that if the Japanese had 20 islands, Nimitz and his brethren would hit the third one, take it, then hit the seventh one, take it, and then the fifth one, and then the ninth, and totally keep the Japanese off guard, and waste all the defenses that were expended on the men who would slowly starve on the unattacked islands. That's what the Germans did. They would hit the Bahamas really hard for a few months. When they got counterattacked, they go to the bauxite, counterattack to Brazil. They went to New Zealand. Their raiders went to the Antarctic. Lube oil from whale oil was very valuable. It was extremely good lubricant for high quality precision manufacturing. So the Germans went into the whaling fleet, captured the mother vessel, and had the Norwegians say, "You come back to base." And so all of the boats came back to base, and they all got kidnapped as they came back to base. So they captured the entire whaling fleet in the Antarctic. So people say, "Oh, where did the Germans go?" That is not the question. The Germans sent raiders north over Russia into the Pacific. Like, who's done that? Nobody did it for 50 years after the Germans did it. So the question is simply, where didn't the Germans go? What didn't the Germans do? They were in the Red Sea, the Indian Sea, they had Port Klang in Malaysia, and they did whatever they wanted, really, for a long time. And when they failed, and the Black May of 1943, when we counterattacked, and if you saw the picture, they had all these dots on the submarine conning tower. It was like every few months they'd come up like a 3-centimeter radar and a way to detect it, and they were always kind of trying to stay ahead of the enemy. But we finally figured it out in May of 43 and just walloped them. Sank so many submarines. Apparently we sank like 3 of the biggest war heroes in German history in like a week. So they just retreated. They said, everyone come back to base, kind of like after these 2 ships collided with merchant ships in the Pacific a few months ago. The commander of the Navy fleet said, "Okay, everyone come back to Hawaii and let's figure out what we're doing wrong." So that's what Nimitz did, and they never regained that strength. It was a scrap tonnage war. Sink more tonnage than they could replace. And inevitably, we started producing more than they could sink. And once that happened, it was over. But if you get hit, they didn't care what cargo or what men were on the ship. They could care less. They just wanted the ship sunk. That's all. Because a ship would take a year to replace, or it used to. Then it took a week. And there's one interesting point. If you could cut off the Venezuelan oil from Maracaibo going anywhere in the world, mostly to London, if you could cut it off at the source, because there's a bar that you got to cross over to get out of Maracaibo to get to Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, to get, So they did. They sank the shuttle tankers. The shuttle tankers took a year to replace because they were specialized vessels. They sank 2 of them, and then the Chinese crew refused to serve because they didn't want to get sunk. So they won. They were smart. Then they went back to bomb the refineries, and a bunch of school kids came running out, and they thought they were being counterattacked. They forgot to take the plug out of the gun blew up, and the whole thing failed. But they came close to shutting off the oil in Venezuela. Had they done that, the whole U-boat campaign would have been a moot point, because they would have won. England wouldn't have had the oil to win the war. As it was, my understanding is they sank 1 tanker every 10 hours in the beginning of 42. 30% of all Allied losses happened in the Bahamas and Hatteras area. 30% of worldwide losses in the spring of 42, when the mayors refused to turn off the lights. Hardigan felt so sorry for the civilians watching him sink ships in Florida that he used to go on the beach side and fire out into the ocean, putting himself in big peril so that he didn't kill civilians on the beach. That's how crazy it got. I mean, he felt bad, just crazy. And just as a footnote, World War I in Orleans, Massachusetts, shells landed on our beaches from from German submarines who would go, they did two things. They would go to the Navy base in Newport and have lunch, and then they'd leave the Navy base and sink British ships. So that, the British didn't like that too much. And they also sent Deutschland and another cargo submarine. They would go under the British blockade in World War I, go to Baltimore, New York, Boston, trade with us, like buy and sell, and then go under the blockade and go back to Germany.
The Bremen.
Sorry?
The Bremen.
Yeah. So somebody else, thank you. Somebody else had a hand?
No, they don't have a hand. We have a hand for you.
Oh, thank you.